From an evolutionary standpoint, humans may be predisposed to respond to frustration and provocation with anger and potentially aggression. So, when we are prevented from obtaining some desired goal, researchers have even found that if infants are taught to raise their hand to reveal a picture, so there's a string tied to their arm, and that's also tied to a pulley that when they lift their arm, it lifts a door to reveal a picture. If they learn that and then they are restrained so that they can't move their arm to reveal the picture, so they can't obtain their goal. Researchers have found that infants display angry facial expressions in that particular scenario. So even in infancy, we have this connection between goal prevention and anger. And so many of you may have experienced something similar if you have been late and you're stuck in a traffic jam. Maybe you've even had aggressive impulses in this scenario. But also many of us know that we have an amazing ability to control these impulses. We can get frustrated, angry, we can be provoked without responding aggressively. Many of us have developed alternative responses such that we rarely, maybe even never, respond with aggression. So clearly, although frustration is inevitable, aggression may not be. And so we can examine factors that influence the likelihood of aggression. And this phrase is key because the argument is that those variables that we'll discuss in this class increase the likelihood of an aggressive response. So we're not saying that any of these variables are sufficient or necessary causes of aggression. They are part of a larger constellation of environmental and internal variables that make up a behavioral episode. So when we say that there's a relationship, for example, between heat and aggression, we're not saying that if you are having a great day and everything's going your way and you're living your best life, that just because it's hot outside, you're going to turn to a stranger and out of the blue, for no reason, punch them in the face. Right? That's not what we're claiming here. What we are saying instead is that if you're provoked or frustrated, that stranger insults you to your face, that the hot temperatures may sort of push you over the edge. And so you're more likely to respond to that provocation with aggression when it is hot out. So again, aggression is an optional response to provocation. Rather than being fixed, it is malleable. And so we're looking at what factors could increase the likelihood that someone chooses that aggressive response when they have multiple optional responses that are possible. And so one factor that may influence aggressive behavior is culture. Certain cultural values may make aggression more acceptable or even a socially desirable response in some situations. And so we'll look at what's called culture of honor. Culture of honor is an attempt to explain the disparate rates of specifically violent crime in the southern US compared to states in the north. The theory is that the South has this long history of agriculturalism in which specifically the cattle industry has dominated the economy. From this rose the cultural value of sort of masculine, rugged toughness in the South. And this masculine toughness was valuable because if your livelihood depended upon raising cattle and transporting them often across long distances, then your livelihood also depended upon defending your cattle from theft. So defending yourself essentially from cattle rustlers. And the idea is that an aggressive, tough reputation may have been a good defense. that if you're the sort of man who has a reputation in the community and the surrounding region, that you can be insulted or pushed around without retaliation, then if I'm a thief, guess who I'm going to target? I'm going to target the guy who has a reputation for being weak or a pushover. Okay? And so men from the South, even today, according to this theory, may view insults as an attack on their reputation and respond strongly and aggressively because they have inherited these cultural values that support this type of response. And so Nesbitt and colleagues conducted what is dubbed the A-hole experiment in 1996. The study took place at the University of Michigan and consisted only of male participants. Those who reported that they had lived in the South for a period of at least 6 years were considered to be Southern. The prediction was that males from the South would respond to an insult with more aggression compared to Northern males. The participants were first asked to fill out a short survey and then to turn it in down the hall. As the participant walked down the hall, a confederate of the experimenter walked out of a door marked Photo Lab and began working at a file cabinet in the hall. The confederate had to push the file drawer in to allow the participant to walk by him and go to the end of the hall to drop off his paper at the table. As the participant returned seconds later and walked back down the hall toward the experimental room, the confederate, who had reopened the file drawer at this time, slammed it shut, and on seeing the participant approach, bumps into him and calls him an a-hole. This is the experimental condition. In the control condition, our participant is not bumped into and they are not insulted. They're not called an a-hole. So after our participant is either bumped and insulted or not bumped, not insulted, he continues walking down this long hallway. Another confederate, a pretty big guy, 6'3", 250 pounds, appears around the corner and begins walking toward the participant. The hallway is lined with tables, so it's very narrow. So narrow that only one person can pass through the hallway at any given moment. So that means that as our participant is walking down the hall and as our confederate is walking down the hall, at some point, someone's going to have to give way and turn to let the other person pass. Our confederate is instructed to sort of barrel forward, not to, tackle our participant, but to wait until the very last second, forcing our participant to be the one to turn and let the confederate pass. Now the question is, how long does our participant wait? We have essentially here a game of chicken, right? And so the question is, how long does our participant wait? How close do they let the confederate get before they give way and let him pass by? So what Cohen and colleagues found was that for our Southern males who had been insulted, they let the confederate get significantly closer before turning to let him pass. And the researchers interpreted this as a more aggressive response. So after being insulted and bumped into, our Southern males are engaging behaviorally in a more aggressive way. Right? They're taking longer before they turn and let the confederate pass by. They're behaving more aggressively in sort of this game of chicken. After this occurs and our participant goes back into the experimental room, they are swabbed and their saliva is later tested for levels of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and levels of testosterone. And so our Southern subjects who have been insulted have higher levels of cortisol. They are physiologically indicating that they're more stressed, and they have higher rates of testosterone. Now, the relationship between testosterone and aggression is tricky. We're not entirely sure what that relationship is, but these higher rates of testosterone may suggest that our Southern participants who are insulted are physiologically primed for aggression, right? Based on these higher testosterone levels, these higher cortisol levels. After the swab, they are asked to read through hypothetical scenarios and to indicate what their response would be, or what the response of the individual in the hypothetical scenario should be. And so one of these scenarios was something like, it had been only 20 minutes since they had arrived at the party when Jill pulled Steve aside, obviously bothered about something. "What's wrong?" asked Steve. "It's Larry. I mean, he knows that you and I are engaged, and he's already made 2 passes at me tonight." Jill walked back into the crowd, and Steve decided to keep his eye on Larry. Sure enough, within 5 minutes, Larry was reaching over and trying to kiss Jill. And our participant is asked, if you were Steve, what would you do? And what the researchers found was that the Southern males who had been insulted were more likely to write about an aggressive response to this scenario. So they were more likely to say, if I was Steve, I would punch Larry's lights out, rather than writing about a behavior that is less aggressive in response to this scenario. So we have here their self-reported kind of scenarios of how they would behave are much more aggressive. When we look at the physiological measures, we see higher rates of cortisol and testosterone, and behaviorally in this sort of game of chicken, they're acting more aggressive when they are insulted and the male is from the South, compared to either group of males who are not insulted, or compared to the Northern male who is insulted. So specifically our Southern males who are insulted that are indicating these higher aggressive levels.